All right, welcome everybody to night 3 of our 24 live streams. And tonight we're going to start getting into the guts of the legislation. And as always, I like to start these meetings off by reciting the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Once again, as a reminder, that is our mission statement as Americans. Those are our goals as a country. The preamble outlines those 5 duties of Americans. And tonight, the first section of the legislative package deals with the first one, establishing justice. So before we go, I'm just gonna quick update. I'm on day 3 of my fast, day 3 of 24, and day 3 is the toughest. My body's still kind of running off of the last meal that I ate. It hasn't switched over to burning fat yet, so I'm a little not quite feeling as great today. And my weight's at 200 pounds, still a very, very healthy weight. All right, we're going to go ahead and jump into the findings here. Let's see if I can get this to All right, let's share the screen again. And well, actually, let me just recap. All right, the Trump-Biden peace plan is a 311-page legislative package. You can find a link in the description below to read it, follow along, and to see the details of exactly how we can do the things that we have the power to do: end poverty, end mass incarceration, end the endless wars. In short, the deal for Congress is simple. Pass this legislation before the election by October 23rd, and we can, the American Union of Swing Voters will let you keep your jobs. You know, as swing voters, it just takes a tiny percentage to control the balance of power in Washington, D.C. And so this is how we can get leverage over the entire system, by unionizing as swing voters. You know, the presidential election race, I'll look at the polls probably again in a couple days, go over them. But it's so close. They're fighting over Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. You might know that Nebraska is one of 2 states that apportions its electoral college votes separately by congressional district, as well as a winner-take-all. And so they call it the blue dot of Nebraska, this 2nd congressional district around Omaha. And in order to possibly pick up that electoral vote, the Trump campaign Republicans, Lindsey Graham, have been pressuring Nebraska legislators to change the way, in the last 2 months before the election, change the way that electoral vote will be apportioned. That's how close this election is. This is the opportunity for swing voters to come together around one set of demands, the Trump-Biden peace plan, and demand that Congress do something. We can hold them accountable by giving them a different metric to be accountable to. Right now, too frequently, they're just held accountable by political party, right? A couple years ago, I made a great animated little short showing how the United States, we've swung back and forth between Republicans and Democrats repeatedly over the last 3 decades, because the people in the middle, when they recognize that the party in power sucks, the only thing they can do is kick them out and replace them with the other party. And then they realize that party isn't doing them any good either, and then they replace them with the first party again, and it just goes back and forth and back and forth. It's a pendulum. Because the only metric that we judge our candidates by, not the only metric, but the primary one that we judge our candidates by, is their party affiliation. And by writing our own legislation through a People's Legislative Assembly, by crowdsourcing the work that Congress is failing to do, we create a new metric for judging candidates for federal office. Did they get something done before the election? In this case, enact the Trump-Biden peace plan. If they did, we let them keep their jobs. If they did not, we can replace them with their major party opponents. As long as we're stuck with a two-party system, and we are, as long as elections are winner take all, these are our two options. The party in power, the party trying to get power. And by pitting them against each other, not as a way to defeat them or destroy them, but as a way to incentivize them to act on behalf of the people of the United States, to incentivize them to serve the American public, we can create an upgrade to our democracy. But in order for that to work, you have to have specific details. You can't be like candidates who run on nebulous campaign promises and then don't actually get anything done. We need a very specific metric to judge Congress and the incumbents by. That's written down in the Trump-Biden peace plan. To make sure that everyone in the United States has the opportunity to understand exactly what it is the American Union is bargaining for, we're going through each section of the legislative package one by one over the next 22 days. And so people have the opportunity to decide for themselves. Do I want to collectively bargain for all 101 policies? Or do I want to stick with politics as usual? There's a better way forward, and that's unionizing as voters. All right, so let's go ahead and let me share my screen again, and we will start digging into the legislation. All right. I've skimmed through the table of contents before. We're going to come down to section 2, the findings and purpose. And I'd just like to go ahead and read these. The Congress finds the following. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. identified the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism, declaring before his death in 1968, our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and to go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal opposition to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo. That revolutionary spirit Dr. King spoke of is embedded within the preamble of the Constitution, which outlines the 5 duties of all Americans, individually and collectively. These ideals are the driver for this legislative package. 3. Tens of millions of Americans live below the poverty line, including millions of children. Dr. King called for a basic income, stating, "We must develop a program that will drive the nation to a guaranteed annual income. We are likely to find that the problems of housing and education, instead of preceding the elimination of poverty, will themselves be affected if poverty is first abolished. The poor, transformed into purchasers, will do a great deal on their own. A host of positive psychological changes inevitably will result from widespread economic security. The dignity of the individual will flourish when the decisions concerning his life are in his own hands, when he has the means to seek self-improvement. Personal conflicts among husbands, wives, and children will diminish when the unjust measurement of human worth on the scale of dollars is eliminated. Now our country can do this." 4. America's system of mass incarceration has grown the prison population to 8 times what it was at the end of Dr. King's life. It has been called the new Jim Crow because of its disproportionate effect on communities of color. Despite similar usage rates across races, people of color are more likely to be arrested and incarcerated in the war on drugs. Dr. King wrote about racial bias in his letter from Birmingham jail. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. It is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, but it is morally right and sinful. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. This is difference made legal. Dr. King spoke vehemently against the endless war of Vietnam, and many of his observations are just as true of the Middle East. The only change came from America as we increased our troop commitments in support of governments which were singularly corrupt, inept, and without popular support. Now they languish under our bombs and consider us, not their fellow Vietnamese, the real enemy. They know they must move on or be destroyed by our bombs. So far, we may have killed 1 million of them, mostly children. We have destroyed their two cherished institutions, the family and the village. We have destroyed their land and their crops. Now there is little left to build on save bitterness. We must speak for them and raise the questions they cannot raise. These too are our brothers. These three evils are addressed by the three planks of the Trump-Biden peace plan. Ending poverty, ending mass incarceration, and ending the endless wars. We'll go on and read the purpose here. The purpose of this act is to help Donald Trump and Joe Biden apply the lessons of Martin Luther King Jr. to the United States and accomplish more by working together before the 2024 election than partisan fighting could accomplish in 4 years, including 1. Reforming and revitalizing our economy with the American Union Jobs Program, delivering much-needed health care reforms, and establishing 18 weeks of paid family leave. 2. Reforming our criminal justice system and reversing the decades-long trend of mass incarceration. 3. Establishing the United States as a global force for peace and justice by promoting nuclear de-escalation, peace on the Korean Peninsula, and generally improving our moral standing on the world stage. And 4. Negotiating a truce on the wedge issues of guns and abortion, addressing immigration, strengthening Social Security, and bringing an end to destabilizing threats of government shutdowns and debt defaults, so that they might be jointly awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for de-escalating the 2024 election by shepherding passage of this act through Congress. Again, these are the triple evils Dr. King spoke of: poverty, racism, and militarism. And although racism is also very prevalent in our immigration system, which in the immigration and asylum system needs a major overhaul, that is outside the scope of this legislative package. Although when we do get to Title V, securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, we will talk about some of the minor tweaks to the immigration system that are included. So this is the framework for the Trump-Biden peace plan. Those 5 duties and the goal of addressing those triple evils. This is a moral crusade to address poverty, racism, and militarism. It has been more than 6 decades since Dr. King identified them, and they're still an issue in the United States today. So let's do something about it. Just as importantly, the last part of the findings touched on the idea of Donald Trump and Joe Biden winning being jointly awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. When we get to the section providing for the common defense, we'll talk more about what the conditions are for winning a Nobel Peace Prize and how this would very much qualify the two of them to do that. It would be a perfect retirement gift for both of them as they leave national politics forever. All right. So the first title, we're going to go ahead and let me share the screen again here. And the first title is Establish Justice. It's divided into 3 sections with police reforms, prosecutorial reforms, and prison reforms. The first one is the George Floyd Justice Act, and we're going to get to that in just a couple minutes here. First, I'm going to go ahead and read the findings and purpose for Title I into the record. Title I, Establish Justice. Congress finds the following. 1. Americans have a constitutional duty to establish justice, and we are failing as a nation. 2. The United States is among the most incarcerated countries in the world. Just 50 years ago, the U.S. had an incarceration rate on par with most other Western democracies. While the crime rates today are at nearly identical levels, America's incarceration rate is 5 times higher. 3. The American people are not the most evil people in the world. Therefore, something has gone wrong with our criminal justice system. 4. The policy decisions that have led America down the path of mass incarceration have created intergenerational trauma and trapped people in cycles of poverty. Mass incarceration leads to many other societal problems, with nearly 65% of families with an incarcerated or detained family member struggling to meet basic needs, including housing, health, food, and employment. Children with an incarcerated parent are nearly 6 times more likely to be expelled from school and increasingly less likely to graduate from college than children without incarcerated parents. 5. There exists a moral and societal obligation to reform the American legal system so that it is smaller, safer, less punitive, and more humane, consistently striving toward the idea of liberty and justice for all. The federal government has a tremendous impact on the operation of the criminal legal system at the federal, state, and local levels, and with that power comes great responsibility. 6. It is the responsibility of the federal government to lead by example in police reform, teaching de-escalation techniques, reducing the use of military tactics, which have led to worsening police-community relations and unacceptable levels of police violence. In 2020, the world was shocked by the casual manner in which George Floyd was publicly murdered, and outraged by the midnight raid that left Breonna Taylor dead. Nationwide, hundreds of thousands of people languished in jail without having been convicted, often because of an inability to afford cash bail, which leads to an increased likelihood of conviction and lengthier sentences. And for those whose liberties have been violated, the judicial doctrine of qualified immunity restricts access to justice. 7. It is the responsibility of the federal government to lead by example by reforming punitive sentencing policies, frequently in service of the war on drugs, which have driven up incarceration rates even as crime has fallen over the last 4 years. In 2004, Weldon Angelos was sentenced to a mandatory minimum of 55 years in federal prison for nonviolent offenses, a sentence so outrageous that the judge in his case called it unjust, cruel, and even irrational. After more than a decade of incarceration, a federal court granted him a sentence reduction. In fiscal year 2022, the average sentence length for individuals convicted of a federal offense carrying a mandatory minimum penalty was 144 months of imprisonment. 8. It is the responsibility of the federal government to lead by example in humanizing incarcerated Americans by reforming cruel and inhumane treatment in prison and promoting practices conducive to rehabilitation. Matthew Charles had served decades in prison before being released in 2016, and by all accounts was a model citizen when the court reversed the decision a year later and sent him back to prison. He began serving the final decade of his sentence until passage of the First Step Act in 2018 brought about his permanent release. A few months later, he attended a White House celebration of the criminal justice reform bill, which prompted Donald Trump to observe that so many incarcerated Americans really are serving 40 and 50-year sentences for things you wouldn't even believe that some people wouldn't even be going to prison for today. 9. The policy decisions of the last half-century must be re-examined in order to build a better America in the 21st century. The purpose of this title is to vigorously pursue our first duty under the Constitution, establish justice. All right. And so those findings sort of lay out the Title I, how it breaks down, the George Floyd Justice Act and its police reforms, Weldon Angelos prosecutorial reforms, and the Matthew Charles Prison Reform Act. So let's talk about criminal justice reform. Criminal justice reform is popular. People recognize that our system is broken. There was an ACLU poll a few years ago that found 91% of Americans say the criminal justice reform has problems that need to be fixing, and with large supermajorities in favor of reducing the prison population. In fact, let me share my screen here again, and we'll just take a look at some of these findings from a forward.us polling. General views of criminal justice reform. I want to say too, this is from 2024. This is this year. This is new polling. 78% of likely voters support criminal justice reform. So if you're a candidate for office, supporting the Trump-Biden peace plan is something popular that 78% of likely voters support. 6 in 10 voters say it makes supporting criminal justice reform makes them more likely to vote for that candidate. Only 1 in 10 say it would make them less likely. These numbers are up from October 2022, and opposition is down. Support for reducing incarceration, ending mass incarceration, right? This is one of the 3 planks. How important or unimportant is it? And of all likely voters, 65% say it's very important or somewhat important. What is the impact of mass incarceration? Which of these statements comes closer to your view? Neither is exactly right. Nearly 2 in 3 agree that mass incarceration causes many of the problems that lead to unsafe communities, such as homelessness, poverty, and drug or mental health challenges. As opposed to only 1 in 17 who believe that locking more people up alleviates issues. All right. Yeah, so you can see how many people think that it makes social problems like homelessness, drug use, and drug overdoses better. 6, 7, 5, only 6% of all likely voters thinks that it makes those problems better. People recognize that our system is not working. We need to put the justice back in the criminal justice reform and criminal justice system. All right, and supporting building on the First Step Act. 84% support building on those efforts, which this legislative package will do. Some of these items in here, well, we'll just go. Some of those policies are included within the Trump-Biden peace plan. Not all of them are. Within the George Floyd Justice Act, a good percentage of it comes from the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that the House passed, I believe, twice, and then went to the Senate to die. But many of these common sense reforms, and very few of them, I can only think of one exception, has anything actually moved on since George Floyd's murder more than 4 years ago. So, all right, so let's go ahead and look at the Trump-Biden peace plan here. If you notice from the table of contents, our first section, 111, is the short title and definitions. Definitions are an important part of any piece of legislation. They can totally change. So we defined the definitions in here are all pretty basic. The Byrne Grant Program, the COPS Grant Program, these are existing programs that use a system of federal grants that put money in the hands of local law enforcement, state and local law enforcement. Chokehold or carotid hold is cutting off someone's blood or oxygen flow to their brain. Defining deadly force. Law enforcement agencies, what a no-knock warrant is, use of force, and unit of local government. So, all just pretty basic definitions, but things that are still important to know. All right, qualified immunity reform. So we got two things. Well, all right, so this section of law, section 1983 of Title 42, comes from legislation that Congress passed during Reconstruction, 2 iterations of the Phoenix cycle ago. In 1871. This was the Ku Klux Klan Act. And it was intended to go after state officials who were willfully violating the civil rights of newly freed slaves. And so it worked for a while, and eventually some of these questions came around to the Supreme Court. And there was a 1967 case, Pearson versus Ray, that the Supreme Court said, well, you know what? This section of law, I'm gonna pull this back up here again. This section of law that specifically says anyone who violates the deprives people of their rights, privileges, or immunities secured by the Constitution and laws shall be liable. Well, we don't think that really applies in some cases, like police officers. And so the Supreme Court, 1967, so more than 65 years ago, created this doctrine of qualified immunity, this idea that some public officials were immune from being sued for civil rights violations. This is not something that Congress has passed. So Congress has never given this approval. They have just let the Supreme Court set policy. And as we've talked about a couple times already, this is yet another example of Congress failing to do their job. Congress failing to set policy, which is its responsibility under the Constitution. So we're going to add new language. It shall not be a defense or immunity to any action brought under this section. So what the Supreme Court, what qualified immunity is? Let's talk just a little more about that, right? Essentially means it is a rebuttable presumption that if your civil rights are violated, the law enforcement officer had no idea they were doing anything wrong. Unless you can prove, the burden of proof is on you to prove that they should have known because of a court case in that district where the police were judged to have violated someone's civil rights for doing something almost exactly the same. And I mean almost exactly the same, right? There can be just minor differences, and the courts will throw it out and say, oh, they didn't know, can't sue them. Some of the examples, right, of police officers who have received qualified immunity are things like stealing from just stealing, taking evidence and then not turning it in and pocketing it. And the courts have said, well, they didn't really know that they were doing anything wrong. You can't, there's no court case that would have informed them they were doing something wrong. There are lots of egregious examples. And so I want to emphasize that reforming qualified immunity does not mean that officers will be found guilty. It just means that they'll be able to have a trial, that somebody who claims their rights have been violated will be able to bring the evidence and put it before a judge or a jury and make their case, as opposed to what we currently have, which is a preemptive assumption that nothing bad happened here, move along, nothing more to see. And so that's what the main addition here is addressing the issue of qualified immunity and with law enforcement. There is another phrase, of the United States, or, that we're adding here. And this is to address something called Bivens claims. This deals with federal officers, and federal officers are almost always immune, because that section, that Ku Klux Klan Act, did not say any person of the United States, only of the states and the territories, and so on and so forth. And so as a result, the courts, people who brought lawsuits against federal officers have almost always had them thrown out. There's just a handful of cases where the Supreme Court has said, essentially, for every wrong there must be a remedy, and what has happened here is so obviously wrong that we're going to, even though the Congress hasn't explicitly said you're allowed to sue, we're going to go ahead and allow the suit to go forward. Where are we? Qualified immunity. We do have some polling numbers on reforming qualified immunity, and it's 66%. 66% of the public supports reforming qualified immunity, because people recognize that there's a problem when people in authority can violate civil rights with the expectation that they will not be held accountable for it. All right, and so that's what section 112 does. All right. All right, let's move on to, seeing no questions in the chat, go on to section 113. Section 113 requires training on a duty to intervene. Again, this came up also in the George Floyd case, where Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for 9 minutes until he was, and cost him his life. But there were 3 other police officers who were there as well, and 2 of them, in fact, were convicted and sentenced to prison because they were aware that excessive force was being used and did not intervene. So, while I guess you want to say, great, the system worked out, the officers are being punished and hopefully rehabilitated so nothing like this will happen again. What's even better is if it doesn't happen in the first place. What's even better is if every officer feels at the sight of excessive force being used, what's even better is if they intervene and say, no, we're not doing that. That's not right. And then we can bring down the number of needless deaths in police custody. So Section 113 requires the Attorney General of the United States to establish a training program and to make this training mandatory for federal law enforcement officers. As we'll see later on, there is states are incentivized to enact a similar training program. All right, seeing no questions in the chat. Section 114, restricting the use of chokeholds. This is it's known as can be cited as the Eric Garner Justice Act. In 2014, Eric Garner was selling loose cigarettes in New York City, and the police came by to hassle him, to get him to, and when he did not cooperate, they choked him. Despite the fact that New York City, the New York Police Department had banned chokeholds back in 1993. And this was caught on videotape, his last words, "I can't breathe," and inspired numerous protests. And so as there's the next section of another section of Title 42 of the United States Code is the section that makes it a criminal offense to deprive people of these rights, of their civil rights. And so we add a new section. This includes the application of any pressure to the throat or windpipe, which prevents or hinders breathing or reduces intake of air, uses of maneuvers such as carotid artery restraints that restrict blood or oxygen flow to the brain. To make it very clear that this is a federal civil rights violation to cut off the oxygen and the blood flow to someone's brain. Yeah, I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory. Like I said, the New York Police Department had already banned the chokeholds, carotid holds, but they left a loophole, and so this would close the loophole. Let's say under no circumstances is this acceptable. All right, so the second part of this comes from of this section is changing the burden of proof for prosecuting someone for violating civil rights. Currently, the burden of proof is willfully, and this would reduce it to knowingly or recklessly. Yeah, so let me just talk a little bit about where that comes from. And this comes from a case, Screws versus the United States, back in 1945. And this is down in Georgia, 1945, Jim Crow era. And the sheriff, Screws, was the sheriff in Baker County, Georgia. And they went to arrest a man named Robert Hall, a black man, charging him with theft of a tire. And so they handcuffed him, they took him to the courthouse, and then they beat him. They beat him with their fists, and including a blackjack, weighed 2 pounds, 8 inches long, solid metal, and they beat him for 15 to 30 minutes. Handcuffed, laying on the ground, they beat him for 15, 30 minutes until he was unconscious. And they dragged him through the courthouse into the cell and left him there. Eventually, an ambulance was called, but like Eric Gardner, it was too late. He died within an hour without regaining consciousness. And so a jury convicted Screws of beating this man to death. And he appealed up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, well, this word willfully, like the law says, you have to willfully deprive him of his rights. And it wasn't sufficient, the Supreme Court said, that he had a generally bad purpose to convict. You would have to find that they purposefully deprived the prisoner of their constitutional rights, i.e. the right to be tried by court rather than by ordeal. And so the court threw him out and let Screws off the hook. So the way it works is that in criminal trials, juries are instructed on the elements of each crime, including the intent standard. And so this recommendation for changing this section of the law comes from a report that the Brennan Center for Justice that issued a report on protecting against police brutality and actual misconduct. And so they suggested changing this burden of proof from willfully to knowingly and recklessly. And so willfully means to conclude that a defendant acted willfully, the jury must find the defendant acted with knowledge that one's conduct is unlawful and with the intent to do something the law forbids. That is to say, with the bad purpose to disobey or disregard the law. It seems beating a handcuffed man to death, it seems like you should recognize that is unlawful, but in any case. All right, the knowingly standard. That means that a jury must find the defendant acted intentionally and voluntarily, not because of ignorance, mistake, accident, or carelessness. So that there had to be an intention. It couldn't have just been an accidental thing. And recklessly means the jury must find the defendant acted while consciously disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk that the material element exists or will result from their conduct. So what this change would do is make it so that federal prosecutors would have to prove that a defendant knowingly or recklessly engaged in one of the forms of prohibited conduct under color of law. So, using their badges, their office, in order to engage in it. And this is the report concludes this current language, the willfully, is one of the most challenging barriers to prosecution under the current version of Section 242. So that is Section 242, restricting the use of chokeholds. I think I'm going to stop there for the evening as far as going through the sections of the blueprint. I try and keep this in manageable chunks. I know people's eyes glaze over. You know, again, it's reading legislation is not something everyone enjoys, but in order to create this new metric to hold our members of Congress accountable, we have to be specific. Exactly what changes we expect to see in the United States Code, how exactly we are going to reform our criminal justice system, how we're going to end poverty, how we're going to end the endless wars, all these sorts of things. The burden is on us to set a standard, and so I need your help in generating the leverage to persuade Congress to act this year. Again, swing voters are the ones who have the power. We have the power. The question is, who will meet our terms? Incumbents or challengers? Incumbents have the power, have the ability to enact laws, right? We don't need to elect them in order to give them that power. They already have it. And if they're not using it to serve the American people, then they can be replaced. They can be removed from office. Their party can be kicked out of the majority. And we talked about this pendulum. We can give the other party another chance while sending a very clear message that if they do not get things done before the election, that there will be consequences. So if the current Congress fails to act, the next Congress, the 119th Congress, will be on notice that they'll need to meet the terms of the American Union if they want to stay in power. All right. Not sure there's anything else we want to cover tonight other than just, so, right, how can you help? First is by visiting anamericanunion.com, becoming a dues paying member for 25 cents a day, $7 a month. Second thing you can do is help break the polls by answering any pollsters that you are a true swing voter, that you are willing to vote for both Republicans and Democrats, depending on who gets the American Union endorsement. When we looked at the polls a couple of days ago, we saw how very, very close the race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is, both on a national level and in those 7 key swing states. And this is true for many, 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 many races. Ballotpedia, I think, has about 10% of House races are competitive. And so it's just a small percentage that can swing it in one direction or another, that can decide the balance of power in Washington, D.C. And by leveraging that tiny percentage across all 470 federal races, we can get leverage over Washington, D.C. We can persuade them to want to cooperate, right? I read this quote from Martin Luther King a couple days ago, where he said, "Our nettlesome task is to organize our strength so that the government cannot elude our demands." This is how we do that, by writing the demands out into a legislative package so that they can't say, well, we didn't know what you wanted. Make it very clear, this is exactly what we want. These are our demands. End poverty, end mass incarceration, end the endless wars by passing the Trump-Biden peace plan. The other sentence that I read was, "We must develop from strength a situation in which the government finds it wise and prudent to collaborate with us as a union of swing voters, as the deciders. Any politician or party that wants to win power in Washington, D.C. will find it wise and prudent to collaborate with us." We do not, as voters, we don't have to go hat in hand to our politicians and say, please, will you do this thing? When we control the winning block of votes, they will find it wise and prudent to collaborate with us so that we can finally address those triple evils that Dr. King identified more than 60 years ago. So, Become a dues-paying member of the American Union, help break the polls, and 3, join a national fast for peace on Tuesday, October 15th, exactly 3 weeks before the general election. The fast for peace is simple: abstaining from food and recreational intoxicants for 24 hours, just drink water. This is based on the tactic that Gandhi used in India to bring together the Hindus and Muslims for a common goal of Indian independence. And we can do the same thing: bring together Republicans, Democrats, Greens, forward parties, libertarians, any disgruntled voters, anyone who recognizes that the system is not serving the marginalized millions. We can come together and with one unified set of demands written out in the Trump-Biden peace plan. And with that leverage, they will, politicians will get in front of that parade in order to win. As you know, I'm undergoing a 24-day fast, and so please join me for 24 hours on the 24th day, October 15th, and share your commitment to these goals on social media with the hashtag #FastForPeace. And we will create the moral pressure on Congress to act. So, all right. I think that's about it. Seeing no questions in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up for tonight. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about the sections 115, the Peace Act, police exercising care with absolutely everyone, which we're going to talk about what section 116, restricting no-knock warrants, certifications for requirements for law enforcement, and establishing a national police misconduct registry. The way that we're going to incentivize states to go along by conditioning burn grants on their cooperation, and the legal services grant program, the tax on lawyers, and the voucher system for people who are arrested to get them access to legal knowledge. Talk about all those things tomorrow. I hope you'll join me then at 7 p.m. Eastern. Thanks. Have a good night.